Hello everyone, this presentation is going to show you the history of Eastern European immigrations to the United States. So let's begin with the characterizations of immigrants. About 12.5 million people immigrated to the United States in only 2 decades, between 1891 and 1910. Most of these immigrants originated in the nations and regions that made up Eastern Europe, including Austria-Hungary, Poland, and Russia. However, those who left these nations did not always claim to be of their heritage. It is impossible to precisely split immigration from Eastern and Central Europe into nationalities cults since the border of nations in 19th centuries. Eastern Europe changed so frequently. Countries like Poland, which had existed for centuries as independent states, vanished as a result of Russia and Austria-Hungary expanding their empires and annexing several smaller nations. In addition to the Poles, numerous other ethnic groups, including the Lithuanians, the Czechs and Slovaks, and the Croatians, etc. So, Austria-Hungary was also the country that had a large number of immigrants to the USA. The Austro-Hungarian Empire originated with the unusually long-lasting rule of a royal Austrian family, the Habsburg, whose dynasty originated in 1282. From their Austrian kingdom, the line of Habsburg rulers expanded their holdings throughout Europe. By 1526, the central components of the kingdom were Austria, Hungary, and Bohemia. But the various times, the empires include Spain, Italy, Belgium, and Balkans, and more. From 1815 to 1848, Austria dominated European politics as a leading power of both German and Confederations and the Holy Alliance. The Austrian Empire changed its name to the Dual Monarchy of Austria-Hungary in 1867. The major populations of Hungary pushed on this arrangement to acquire equal rights with Austria, even though the two realms had long been united under Habsburg authority. The modern nations of Austria, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic were all a part of Austria-Hungary at this time, as were portions of Poland, Romania, Italy, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and the Herzegovina, and Serbia and the Montenegro. There were roughly 52 million people living there, spread out over a region roughly the size of Texas. The diversity of the populace was astounding. Around 10 million Germans and 9 million Hungarians made up the two largest ethnic groups. By the end of 19th century, the new middle class and the working class were finding voice. Many were advocating some forms of socialism, a political and economic system that does away with private properties, placing the nation's manufacturers and distributions of goods into the immigrations from the empires begins. After the dual monarchies was established, Austria-Hungary permitted anyone in its empire who wished to live to do so. It's setting off a mass migrations to the United States. The Czechs in Bohemia and the Slovaks from Hungary began to migrate in a large number to the United States. Austria-Hungary was struggling to maintain its position as a global power by the early 20th century. Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is Serbia, was acquired by Austria in 1808. Entering the newly established Kingdom of Serbia. Serbian nationalists killed the Habsburg Archduke Francis Ferdinand between 1863 to 1914, the emperor's nephew, to the Austrian throne on June 18, 1914. In Sarajevo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, World War I was started by their deeds. The Central Powers, which include Austria-Hungary, Germany, Italy, and Turkey, fought against the Allies, which include France, Russia, the United Kingdoms, and United States. Following the Central Powers' defeat and the fall of their empires at the end of the war in 1918, the mass migrations in the turmoil of the last centuries of the Habsburg rule between 1820 and 1920, somewhere between 3.7 and 5 million people immigrated from the Austro-Hungarian Empire to the United States. The immigrants were Czechs, Slavs, Slovak, Ukrainians, Poles, Magyars, Austrians, and others, and they left for reasons ranging from the persecutions of bad cops at the homes to hope of better life in America, since there were not one national groups but many. They scattered, establishing communities within the United States by national groups. Hungarian Americans between 1849 and 1851, a first very small wave of Hungarian immigrants entered to the country. 4,000 of rebels who had successfully led an uprising in Austria-Hungary in 1848 made up the new immigrants. By the time of America's Civil War, 1861 to 65, there were only around 4,000 Hungarian Americans in the country overall, but roughly 800 of them served in the Union Army, fighting for the North, and a considerably smaller number in the Confederate Army, fighting for the South. Several Confederate soldiers went on to become officers. Thus, the populations of Hungarian Americans who served in the military was the greatest. Hungarian Americans thereby had the highest percentage of their total population serving as soldiers and officers in the Civil War service of any ethnic groups in America at that time. The largest wave of Hungarian immigration to the America began in 1880 and lasted until 1914. Between 1880 and 1899, about 430,000 Hungarians entered the United States. The number jumped to the 1,260,000 for the years of 1899 to 1914, with the peak years in 1907 when 185,000 Hungarians immigrated. Hungarians made up nearly half of all the immigrants from the Austria-Hungary, at a total of about 1,815,000 immigrants from the 1867 to the 1914s. Most of the immigrants in this wave were young peasant men who hoped to earn enough money in the United States to return to the Hungary and set themselves up in a better circumstance there. An estimated 70% of immigrants actually did return to Hungary, but the rest settled permanently in the United States. Although the majority of Hungarian immigrants had been farmers in Hungary, Phil took up farming in America. Their goal was to earn money quickly, and the best place to do that was in the industrial center of the Northeast and Midwest. They took low-paying menial jobs that no one else wanted. Many of the jobs were dangerous, such as mining or working in iron and steel mills. Serious injuries and death were common because most of immigrants were hoping to return to Hungary in the near future. They saved as much of their earnings as possible. With the beginning of the World War I in Europe in 1914, Hungarian immigration to the United States halted. As Hungary and the United States were on the opposing sides of the war, Hungarian Americans found themselves in the difficult positions caught between their ties to Hungary and loyalty to their new home. At first, they continued to show allegiance to Hungary, but once the United States officially entered the war in 1917, Hungarian Americans felt it necessary to make a show of allegiance to America. Although most Hungarian Americans still sympathize with the Hungary, they began to celebrate American holidays and hold loyalty parades in order to escape harassment in the United States. Polish was the largest group of immigrants to the United States. In the 16th century, the Polish kingdom was large and powerful and experiencing what is often called its golden age. Polish artists and scientists were producing great works, and the country was enjoying peace and religious toleration, while other parts of Europe were experiencing bloody conflicts between the Catholics and the Protestants. Poland and Lithuania had united through a royal marriage in 1386. During the 16th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth spread out to include Ukraine and part of Russia. Around 10% of Poland's population at that time were landowners, and Poland was a monarchy, but nobility grew very powerful, severely restricting the king's authorities and referring to themselves as nobles democracy. They attempt to rule by the consensus. Unless there was disagreements in the parliament, the decision was not made. As a result, Poland saw almost no legislations passed for a long time. In the interim, only the aristocracies had access to the democratic features of the government. About 90% of Poles were impoverished peasants who had been conscripted into the serfdom. As the nobility grew more powerful, they were made to work for a lord, a landowner who had virtually complete control over their life, including where they lived, what work they did, and who they married. As the nobles undercut the power of the kings and reduced the peasants to a form of slavery, Poland suffered greatly. Poland's neighbors, Russia and Prussia and Austria, took the advantage of the internal problems and invaded the regions. They began dividing Poland among themselves beginning in 1772 by taking about one-third of its territory. They partitioned it a second time in 1793, and the third and the final partitioning of 1795. The nations of Poland stopped to exist. Austria-Hungary took over Galicia, and Prussia got northwestern Poland, and Russia took Ukraine and eastern and the central of Poland. Polish immigration to America begins. The Polish nobilities were not happy with the partitioning of Poland. Under the new government, they lost the extensive powers they had enjoyed. Starting in the 1760s, many began to immigrate. They often set up exile communities in the European cities, trying to promote interest in the restoration of their former country. Some of these exiles became ardent proponents of the democracies, and when they heard about the American revolutions, quite a few of them traveled across the Atlantic to help the American colonizers fight the British. Among these adventurous Poles was Polish statesman and military hero Tadeusz Kościuszko, who later returned to the United States to serve as a link between President Thomas Jefferson and the leaders of French revolutions. Count Kazimierz Pulaski, who had distinguished himself defending Poland against the Russians before partitioning, also came to fight with the rebels in the revolutions. Pulaski formed his own cavalry and earned the titles the Fathers of American Cavalry before being killed in the battles of Savannah, Georgia. Polish immigration from the 1770s to about 1870 is sometimes referred to as the first wave, but more often of the first wave is considered to have begun in 1820, when the Polish serfs were given their freedom and began to immigrate. Just as the serfs were freed, the United States began encouraging immigration to help rebuild the country after the devastations of the American Civil War. Up to 2 million Poles immigrated to the United States between 1870 and 1914. In this first significant wave of immigration, sometimes known as the Old Exodus, the majority of Poles were single young men looking for the opportunities to work at wage-earning positions, save up their money, and then return to Poland. While the majority remained in America, just about 30% actually went back to Poland. They were untrained and unprepared for the American industrialized environment, since they were uneducated peasant farmers. With the Russian revolutions of 1917 and the defeat of Austria-Hungary and Germany in World War I, Poland regained its independence, forming its own government in 1918. Nazi Germany invaded Poland at the very beginnings of the World War II in 1939, oppressed the country throughout the war. Poland suffered losses of life and properties, and an estimated 6 million Poles were killed, and half of them are Jews. The remaining population suffered near starvation throughout the Nazi occupations. In January 1945, Poland was liberated by the Soviet and Polish armies, and it quickly formed a new government. The second wave, or the new immigrations of Polish Americans, came to the United States under the Displaced Persons Act of 1948, which allowed Europeans who had been displaced by the destructions of the World War II to enter the country as immigrants. These second wave Polish Americans tend to be the well-educated, intellectual, the writers, artists, and scholars who had been targeted by the Nazi of eliminations. A number of them were Jews. A third wave of Polish immigration to the United States began in the 1990s and continues today, although it is a small number. Like a first wave immigrants, the immigrants were mostly young men hoping to find better economic opportunities in America, so that they can save up their money and return to home to the Poland. So let's see how the Polish assimilated with their new country. Polish American culture. The Polish American communities has been in the United States for several generations, and as is often the case, traditional Polish ways are being lost by later generations. Polish language proficiency is limited or non-existent among third and subsequent generations Polish Americans. Many Polish Americans choose to shorten and otherwise Americanize their names in order to blend in better with the mainstream society when they first arrive. Immigration officials actually shortened some arriving Poles' names on their entire entry papers because they either could not understand their actual names or did not care to write it out. Today, some young Polish Americans are reclaiming their true Polish name. Nearly all Polish Americans are either Catholic and Jews. When Polish Catholics arrived in America, they found the Roman Catholic Church controlled by Irish Catholics who had arrived earlier. The Irish Catholics did not welcome the newcomers, and the Polish Americans began establishing their own church whenever and wherever possible. In 1896, a number of Polish Americans decided to separate from the Roman Catholic Church entirely formed the Polish National Catholic Church (PNCC) instead. The PNCC is very similar to the Roman Catholic Church in all but two important ways. PNC's priests are allowed to marry, and church officials are elected rather than appointed. And next, the Russian is also the second largest immigrants from the Eastern Europe. Russian Americans. The term Russian Americans is somewhat confusing because it can be used to refer either to the Russian immigrants or the immigrants from any of the former countries of the Soviet Union. In these chapters, the term is used to refer to the ethnic Russian immigrants. Most historians count three major waves of immigration from Russia to the United States. The first wave occurred just after Russian Revolution's 1917 to 21, stretching from the 1920 into the 1930. The second wave occurred after the World War II from 1945 until the early 1950. And the third wave began in the 1970 and continued today. Immigration begins. Before the Russian Revolution, there had been several significant waves of the immigration to the United States. The first Russians to set foot on the North American continent were traders from Siberia, who traveled across the Bering Strait in the 17th century in search of wild animals. They settled in Alaska and maintained a Russian colony there. During the 18th and early 19th centuries, Russians from the middle class had fled Russians to escape the oppressive Tsar governments of that time, many immigrating to the United States. Many of Russia's peasants immigrated to the Americas after Alexander II freed the Russians serfs in 1861. 9 out of 10 Russian immigrants to the United States between 1861 and 1914 were peasants. The majority were young, unmarried guys who came to America in search of work and better life. The first major wave of Russian-American immigration did not occur until the Russian Revolution. It's considered largely of the Russian middle class and aristocracy who certainly found it uncomfortable to be in their homelands. Under the communists, about 40,000 Russians came to the United States in the first few years after the revolution. In the 1930s, many more Russians who had earlier gone into exile in other European cities felt the need to leave Europe altogether in the wake of rising Nazi movement. They tended to settle in the large American cities, particularly in New York. More than 1 million people born in Russia but living elsewhere in Europe by 1930 immigrated to the United States at that time. When Stalin took over the Soviet government in 1930, he introduced strict regulations forbidding immigration. For the next 14 years, only 14,000 Russians managed to escape to the Soviet Union and come to America. And the World War II and Russian immigrations, the second immigrations of the Russian people. Adolf Hitler, 1889 to 1945, Nazi armies invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. The Soviet Union lost more than 11 million soldiers and 7 million civilians during the World War II. Stalin wanted to create a buffer zone of friendly nations around the Soviet Union after the war. With the help of the Soviet military, Stalin helped the Communist Party in many of these countries gain power. By 1948, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and other European countries had communist governments. The United States, an area of the Soviet Union during the war, looked on with horror and disgust at the huge power that the Soviet Union suddenly wielded. The Soviet Union and the United States had become the two superpowers of the planet, and distrust and hostilities between them grew to huge proportions. This was the beginning of the Cold War, 1945 to 1991, between the Soviet Union and the United States and other Western powers. The Cold War set the atmosphere the second wave of the Russian immigrants would encounter after they settled. Most had entered the United States under the Displaced Persons Act of 1948, which rejecting the ongoing immigration law so that Europeans whose lives and homes had been disrupted by the destructions of the World War II could immigrate to the United States. Those Russians who immigrated encountered a second surge of anti-communists in America, this time led by the Senator Joseph McCarthy, 1908 to 1957, who claimed to have proof that communists had infiltrated the government and even the military. This second red scar became a witch hunt, during which many innocent people were harassed and lost their jobs. Russian Americans again felt driven to hide their ethnicities and tried to appear as much like other Americans as possible to avoid trouble. No one was allowed legally to leave the Soviet Union again until the 1960s and 1970s, when the Russian Jews were permitted to immigrate to Israel. Some then moved to the United States shortly after arriving in Israel. A handful of elite Russians, such as artists, scientists, and authors, defected, illegally renounced their Soviet citizenships and requested residencies in the United States. The third wave of Russian immigration to the United States, beginning with the Russian Jews in the early 1970s, picked up the speed with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Since then, almost 1 million Russians have immigrated to the United States. A majority of them are Russians, Jews, and most have settled in New York City. Ethnic Russians have been arriving steadily since the collapse of the Soviet Union, however, perhaps driven by the unstable economy in Russia. Russian American culture. Many first-generation Russian Americans strive to learn English as fast as possible in order to blend in with their American environment and enable themselves to get better jobs. Their children grow up speaking both English and Russian, but when they establish homes of their own, they usually speak only English. Therefore, by the third generations of most Russian Americans no longer speak Russian. Most ethnic Russians who immigrated to the United States were members of the Russian Orthodox Church. It is one of the several branches of the Eastern Orthodox Church which separated from the Roman Catholic Church in 1054. It is called Orthodox because it follows the original Christian writings, using the same prayers today that were used the early days of the Christianity. Many Russian Americans belong to the Orthodox Church in the North Americans, OCNA, the more conservative Russian Orthodox Church in exile, ROCE, which started in the former Yugoslavia in 1922 and spread to the United States after the World War II, used only Russia in its service. The OCNA has about 1 million members. The much smaller ROCE has only 100,000 members. About half of Russia's American population is Jews. Minorities belong to the varieties of Protestant denominations. Most Russian Americans are closely tied to their families, particularly first and second generations immigrants. Elderly relatives are cared for at home, and women often give birth at homes. Young women often live with their parents until they marry. Their sons tend to settle near their parents after marriage. Later generation Russian Americans are more Americanized with the greater focus on the individual nuclear family units. Many traditional Russian foods have become common among the general American population. Mennonite farmers introduced hard wheat to American farmers, and it is now grown on many farms across the United States, and the most Russian Americans have successfully adapted to the American life.
So the next one I want to talk about famous people from this group. So let's get started. The first one that I want to introduce to you guys is Bob Kane, or another name is Robert Kane. Bob Kane was an American comic book writer and artist with Jewish descent. Robert Kane was born in New York City, New York. His birth name was Robert Kahn. Robert Kahn, his parents, Herman Kahn and Augusta Kahn, migrated from Eastern Europe. Kahn attended David Clinton High School in Bronx, where he was friends with future comic book writer Will Eisner. Following his graduation, he legally changed his name to Robert Kane and enrolled at the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art to study art. Later on, he worked in the field of comic writers, with his first work was Peter Pop, published by the magazine Wax in the United Kingdom and by fiction house Jumbo Comic in the United States. Around the 1930s, Superman was very popular for DC Comics, so he decided to create his own superhero, which is Batman, which is also very popular around the world up until today, in which many film and comic studio Kane's work till today. Moving on to the next person. Next person that I want to show you guys is Bronson Pinchot. Bronson Alcott Pinchot is an American actor. He is best known for playing Balky Bartokomous on the ABC sitcom named Perfect Strangers, and many more works like Risky Business, Beverly Hills Cops, and True Romance. Pinchot was born in New York City. His mother, Rosina, was a typist and house cleaner, while his father was a bookbinder born in New York and raised in Paris. Pinchot's paternal grandparents were from Russia and settled in France following the Russian Revolution. Upon returning to the United States, Pinchot's father changed his name to Pinchot. Pinchot graduated at the top of his class from South Pasadena High School and earned a full scholarship to Yale University. There, he resided at Morse College and intended to study fine arts, but instead majored in theater study. Graduating with honor, after graduation, a casting director discovered him, which led to his film debut, Risky Business. The next person that I want to show to you guys is Alexei Vyacheslavoich Brodovich, or Alexei Brodovich. Brodovich was a Russian-born American photographer, designer, and instructor who is most famous for his art direction of fashion magazine Harper's Bazaar from 1934 to 1958. Alexei Brodovich was born in Oliki to a wealthy Polish family in 1898. His father, Charles or Vyacheslav Brodovich, was a respected physician, psychiatrist, and huntsman. His mother was an amateur painter. After fighting in the Russian army in World War I, Brodovich worked as a graphic designer in Paris from 1920 until 1930. When he moved to New York City in 1934, Camusno, editor of Harper's Bazaar magazine, hired Brodovich to lift the magazine with a modern spirit. It was in this capacity that Brodowicz would leave his creative legacy. Brodowicz revolutionized American magazine design. He departed from the static layout and conventional pose studio photograph prevalent in 1930 editorial design. Instead, he emphasized the double-page space as a dynamic field upon which exquisite photographs, Risbononi typeface, and elegant white space were arranged into a total composition. Brodowicz sought to imbue each monthly issue with a visual flow and analogous to a musical composition. Many designers who studied under or were influenced by him, including Otto Storch and Henry Wolff, revitalized American magazine design in the 1950s and 1960s. The next person I want to talk to you guys is George Gershwin. George Gershwin, original name Jacob Gershwin, was born on September 26, 1898 in Brooklyn, New York, USA. Gershwin was considered as one of the most significant and popular American composers of all time. He wrote primarily for the Broadway musical theater, but important as well are his orchestral and piano composition, in which he blended in varying degrees the technique and form of classical music with the stylistic nuances and technique of popular music and jazz. Gershwin was born in a Russian Jewish immigrant family. He was a genius in musical from a young age. Gershwin dropped out of school at the age of 15. After dropping out, Gershwin played in several New York nightclubs and began his stint as a song plugger in New York Tin Pan Alley. After 3 years of pounding out tunes on the piano for demanding customers, he had transformed into a highly skilled and dexterous composer. To earn extra cash, he also worked as a rehearsal pianist for Broadway singers. From his entire career, he produced many famous music like Rhapsody in Blue, I Got Rhythm, and also An American in Paris, which later influenced to produce the movie with the same name, which won Oscar Award in 1951. The next one is Isaac Asimov. Isaac Asimov was born Isaac Yudovic Asimov on January 2, 1920 in Katowice, Russia, to Annabelle Rachel Berman and Yuda Asimov. The family immigrated to the United States when Asimov was 3 years old, in which his family settled in Brooklyn, New York. Isaac Asimov was fond of learning at a young age. Having taught himself to read by the age of 5, he learned Yiddish soon after and graduated from high school at 15 to enter Columbia University, in which he studied there until he graduated in PhD. He became professor at Boston University School of Medicine. However, most notable works are in the field of literature, in which he published many science fiction. The most famous ones are in the Foundation and Robot series. Moving on to the next topic of stereotype that Eastern European group faced. The first one is assumption that they speak Russian. Many people in the US believe that the people from Eastern Europe speak Russian, even though some Eastern Europe countries speak Slavic languages. Russian is not one of them except Russia. In fact, Eastern Europe European countries have around 20 languages. Next stereotype is Eastern European was viewed as hardcore drinker. Eastern European was viewed as hardcore drinker, which they usually consume alcohol on their daily basis, especially vodka. This stereotype is still around today because of the media that usually lampoon about vodka consumption of the Eastern European people. The next stereotype is Eastern European was viewed as rude or emotionless. Many people, when they encounter people from Eastern European or people who are Eastern European descent, they might think these people look angry all the time. This thing happens because Eastern European usually has lower tone of voice, which make the conversation seem to be more serious, and also they are usually not smile. The next stereotype is Eastern European are communist at heart. Communism is the state ideology that completely took over political, social, and economic life in Russia during the Soviet era. Any opposition would attract sometimes little punishment. The ideology was abandoned in 1991, and Russian 21 at least have wholeheartedly embraced the capitalistic lifestyle. However, there are plenty of others who still remain attached to the communist ideal, and it's not that unusual to meet elderly folk with fond memory of the day of the USSR, still as the original comrade fall into her old age. The communist sentiment is becoming far less prevalent in Russia today. The Communist Party of Russia only has about 16,000 members in total. Stereotypes: Russian women are extremely beautiful and obsessed with posh and glamour. Russian women are renowned for their beauty, and it's true. Many Russian women possess quality regarded as classical, attractive, high cheekbones, tall, slim figure, voluptuous lips, and small snub nose. But not all Russian women fit the stereotypical Russian bombshell image. With so many different ethnicities with unique physical attributes living across the vast multicultural expanse of Russia. Representation of Eastern European in popular culture. The first movie that I want to introduce to you guys, The Immigrant. It was a movie in 2013. This movie is about the life of the immigrant from Eastern Europe that moved to America seeking the American dream. In this series, the film represents the life of immigrants from Eastern Europe in the early of 20th century, when they thought about American dream in which they think they will be successful, but they have to face the reality, which is not what they thought. The next movie that I want to show to you guys, Little Odessa. It was a movie in 1995. It is about a long separation from his Russian family. His man Joshua returned to Brighton Beach for a contact killing for Russian mafia. And his abusive father, Arkady, banned him from returning after Joshua committed his first murder. He takes up residence in a hotel, and soon everyone knows he has returned. He goes home to visit his dying mother, Irina, and prepare for the assassination, getting drawn back into the criminal community he left behind. So this movie is a drama movie, and it shows the representation of Eastern European in the kind of mafia figure. So the next movie, which I think you all familiar with, is John Wick. It was a movie in 2014. It's about John Wick, who is a legendary assassin who retired from his career, and he lived with his dog, but eventually somebody killed his dog, and he has to hunt that killer. So in this movie, the main protagonist, John Wick, was born in Russia, and his name before he changed to John Wick was Jadani Junanovich. So it's the second movie that show you that the representation of Eastern European people in the media is quite going the same way. It's going the same way, which is mafia figure or linked to crime organization.